Welcome to Rogue Frequencies. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Matt.
We talk about punk music and culture, but not in the way you would expect. We're using all things punk as a way to learn more about individual and collective human growth and development. So today we are looking at a scene, and as a reminder, we are not trying to be all inclusive in the scene, and especially, as we will talk about in a moment, it's an emerging scene. So there could literally be new bands showing up in the next day or so that we're not aware of, and new bands coming out all the time. So our discussion is not meant to be critical, definitive, or all inclusive, but just give us a shared frame of reference to articulate concepts. So today, we are super excited to be talking about the modern punk scene, especially because where we are in Denver seems to be a real hub for an inclusive modern punk scene. So, Matt, since this week is a little bit different, we want you to give us a little bit of history and background that sort of sets up this current scene. So, as our resident historist, maybe you could give us a little bit of that info.
Yeah, totally. I think first and foremost, whenever we talk about punk scenes, and we've spent a lot of time this year talking a lot about various punk scenes and bands within scenes and stuff, one of the things that has always been emblematic of punk is, for lack of a better term, male rage, male energy, and a male sense of belonging built right into the scenes right from the beginning. And I think most people, when they think about punk, think of, or conjure up this aggressive male-oriented attitude and use that as kind of the segue into any punk scene that might be out there. This is the leather jacket, mohawk wearing, snarling punk of Hollywood, but also like, an image rightly earned over time. The reality, though, is right from the beginning, punk scenes in New York and London and all across the United States and Europe were hyper inclusive of a variety of different experiences. And this could be like bands like the Slits emerging alongside the Clash in London in the late 1970s, bands like X-Ray Spex, which were emblematic in creating not just a female space, but also a space for people of color and young women in general within punk. Or it could be people like Jello Biafra and the Dead Kennedys, who took a different spin on things. And while they were a band, at first, for white men, they took a very clear stand against Nazi energy in their scene, and wrote songs such as "Nazi Punks Fuck Off." All of the early punk bands that we have in the late 1970s and 1980s are performing in or parts of punk scenes all over the world that are very purposefully making space and including all sorts of different types of people. And so while punk has this reputation, again, rightly earned in some manners, of being this very male-oriented space, the reality is it's a lot more complex than that. And I think one of the bands that we highlighted earlier in our season that's really indicative of the complex nature of what it means to have an inclusive space that's layered and sometimes in tension with its scene, but also plays with its place within the scene, is a band like Bikini Kill and Kathleen Hanna, and what her energy within first the Washington scene and then getting linked up with the DC scene did in terms of creating some positive feedback. But then also, some of the energy that she brought wasn't always well received in places that did have more robust inclusivity, places like Gilman, for example, and the documentary Turn It Around, which was a Green Day joint about the Gilman scene in the 1980s. There's this great story from a female band called the Yeasty Girls, who were very unhappy with Hannah and the Girls to the Front and pushing back against male energy at Gilman, because she thought that, the lead singer thinks, hey, this is driving a wedge in our scene. This is something that we don't have a problem with necessarily. And now we're bringing in this energy that's creating this divide, the space between different genders. And that's not what we're about. So all of this to say that, inclusivity, having punk scenes that have a variety of different attitudes about where people fit themselves in has a really complex history. And I think maybe the band, if we're highlighting history, that in my life, in my experience, that really got me thinking about what it means to be a member of a scene and what it means to be a member of an audience and to be a part of punk rock in general is Propagandhi, which is a Canadian band out of Manitoba who was there in the mid 1990s. How to Clean Almost Anything and Let's Talk More Rock, their first two albums, two just kind of seminal punk rock albums, before the band starts moving into a little bit more metalcore sort of sound, that I think are really important in terms of understanding what punk is and can be. And without getting too deep into the details, one of the things that Propagandhi recognized within the punk scene of the 1990s, when I was, in middle school, high school, and finding my way through this music, was that this is a very male-oriented, homophobic, somewhat misogynistic, and then other times overtly misogynistic space. And if you're a young woman, if you're a person of color, if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, if you are something other than a middle-class white man, this is probably not a scene that's making you feel comfortable and not a place where you're going to want to be, right? And for a band like Propagandhi, who is not hadn't broken through in the mid 1990s, to take a stand against some of the energy and some of the predominant attitudes that were all a huge part of punk in the mid 1990s, that risk was rewarded by making place for bands like Against Me, for example, who in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, find their way and emerge onto the scene. And then eventually their lead singer, Laura Jane Grace, goes through a transition in 2000, I think it's 2012. And far from being excommunicated from the scene or people kind of falling off and saying well, here's this really kind of really fun, cool band with, great politics and really catchy riffs and everything else. But we don't like the direction that they've gone because, let's just be honest, then now and for a long periods of time, gender identity and the ability to be your true self within a scene, specifically for someone who is transgendered, not easy. And for many people who are transitioning, there's that reality of how are you going to be received? And Against Me isn't excommunicated. And I read that out as bands like Propagandhi. But if we go right back to the beginning, there's always been this attitude within punk of, well, we're all here to be ourselves. If you're being you, that's cool too. And is that always true? Probably not, right? But punk in general does have this really elaborate history of being inclusive. And in your experience, you've had the opportunity to work with some local bands and some local musicians who have also, glommed onto this idea of, I get to find and define my place in a scene, and punk is a really good place to do this because of the energy that can get marshaled in there. So, I think overall, when we think about punk and we think about the modern punk scene and what we've got going on in Denver, I think it's really important for us just to remember that it's a very complicated, because it's human, because we're all us. It's a very complicated sort of situation. But also, I do think that with punk, once again, more than meets the eye. And I think that there's a richness here that we can sort of get into that allows us to think about who we are and how we get to be in a scene that's designed in a lot of ways to push against people's expectations.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's a good lead into talking about a little bit about what we have observed and experienced in the punk scene of the last few years. There's been I'd say a market transition or a incorporation of more of that inclusivity. And I think it is rooted in a point you made a moment ago of as long as you're showing up as authentic, you get to be here. None of the posers, if this is who you are and this is how you are, and you bring that authentic self here, you get to be here. So I'd like to talk for a moment about a couple of bands that are local to our scene right now, and one of which we talked about last episode in talking about Riot Girl and feminist punk, which is Cheap Perfume. And I was first introduced to them seeing the Descendants before COVID, maybe
Oof,
2017 or 2018.
taking it back.
Yeah. I know it feels like a long time ago now. And Cheap Perfume hadn't been around all that long, but they got a spot with the Descendants in when they were in Colorado Springs at the Black Sheep. And just at that time, it was just Jane, No, and Stephanie. And being like, wow, like these chicks are leaving it on the stage. Like, this is incredible. And shout out to the Descendants for, I think, it being very intentional. I mean, there's no lack of local cis white male punk bands. And I think they very intentionally chose a female punk band.
Right. Yeah.
And so
I believe that. Yeah.
yeah. And I can't know. I didn't talk to them, and I didn't actually ask Cheap Perfume this in the conversation that I had with them. But that, really blew me away. And I started following them then. And then fast forward to, gosh, I guess it was last fall. Cheap Perfume was playing in Denver, but they were opening for Team Nonexistent, who I had not heard of at the time, and went to that show. It was Team Nonexistent's album release party for their most current album, Teeth. And, again, went to see Cheap Perfume because I'm like, these are my girls. I love them. And was blown away by this band of young musicians who are queer identifying, neurodivergent, just how powerful they were. And looking around the room and also feeling very old, but also very, very happy to see that just about everyone around us was under 30 and still wearing like the jacket with the patches, and they were very much embracing the punk look, yet being 20 something years younger than me.
Yeah, that's been such a huge like uplifting element of the scene in Denver over the last couple of years. Is when you go to shows, there was a time there where it was a lot of old heads and a couple young people and everything else, and as people like myself start to age out and move to the back, old punks to the back, it's pretty awesome to see the number of young authentic, energetic punks that know the songs, who know the history, but more than anything else, they know the assignment. They're there to have fun. They're there to express themselves. And, I think that that's such a huge element of what punk is. And, in my experience as an educator and working with young people, the idea that like punk is now a place where queer identity, where nonconformists, or as a former student of mine told me recently, as we reconnected after, years after they graduated, a place for people on the fringe is the term they use. It's really heartening to know that specifically young people are looking at punk and seeing this is a place for me to be myself and be included. I think especially during this time when like that punk ethos and that punk mentality is being co-opted by people with quasi-fascistic identities and policies and politics that seek to atomize society and disconnect us from each other and say like, well, I'm punk because I'm breaking stuff. And it's like, no, you clearly don't understand what you're talking about. You're taking one part of punk, maybe the most easily identifiable, easily graspable piece, and just saying like, oh, that's punk and that's what I am. And it's like, no, you're not. These people, people who are out there to see Team Nonexistent, they're punk. Right? They're the people out there who get it. They understand what we're doing here. And it's so heartening to have that as such a key element of our scene.
Yeah, and if we throw back to the roots of punk and earlier episodes in this podcast, we talk about the Ramones. They were fringe, right? They were the guys that when they, tale as old as time. They showed up and everybody is like, who let them out of the institution they were in? They
Yeah.
were so fringe. And what we're seeing is what started as fringe white males not feeling included because they were sort of outcasts, getting angry and reclaiming their power, their voice through anger in music. What we see now is with this current generation, the Zoomers, the Alphas, showing up and saying, we're fringe and we're reclaiming a space for us in this scene. And I think there's pieces of Team Nonexistent's story that really are an important part of how that happens. So I'd like to tell that story now. And I am retelling a story that was told to me by the band. So Team Nonexistent, I am confident that you will hear this, and I hope I represent your story well. And I apologize if I get some of the details wrong, because we did speak a year ago.
So we'll
But
Liv doing the historist thing now.
I know I am now an honorary historist.
That's it. That's it. That's all you need to be a historist is a microphone and a story to tell.
Well, I've certainly got that right now. So in speaking with them, Team Nonexistent started for Sophia in her bedroom as a bit of an audio diary. And calling it Team Nonexistent, she was one woman with a guitar and a gorgeous voice and a microphone, and the team didn't exist. Her ideal group didn't exist, and at the time she was living in Florida, if I remember correctly, and feeling a bit isolated, a bit lonely, a bit alone. The Team Nonexistent, the team that doesn't exist, and it's just her. And fast forward, she comes to Colorado, she's playing, and Magic is at the location she's playing at doing sound, and speaks to her after and was like, we gotta team up, for lack of a better word. And Team Nonexistent then adds all of their band members from there. And they went through a few band members before they settled on this 4 that have real magic with one another. In the feeling sense, they have a real clear love for each other and adoration for each other on stage. It's so clear they love being a band and love playing together. As a matter of fact, when we spoke, they said that they were really excited to be speaking with me because it gave them an excuse to hang out an additional time that week. And how often does a band say that, like, we want to hang out more? Like, usually you hear the stories of like, we're sick of each other, but they have this genuine love because it came out of that real authentic, like, we are on the fringe, but we are coming together and we are making not just our own band, but our own scene. And in that, they have created a scene. It's really clear. I've now seen them 3 times, I believe. And it is a different and distinct scene from the other punk bands that you and I see a lot of shows together, with bringing our partners along and sometimes our kids. And they have a distinct scene that is different than the others. We've talked about, I believe, at other times on this podcast of how, and we definitely talk about it upcoming in the NoFX one, about how there are times where you look across the crowd at a punk show and you can see subgenres all over, by people's dress, by the music they like, which bands they get into when it's a festival. Team Nonexistent, when I see them, it is clearly a very intentional scene. And the band is really mindful. They became mindful early on, and I think this is a real credit to them, despite their relative youth. They're really clear that they had a responsibility not just to play music, but to be intentional about policing their scene, for lack of a better word, making sure that the people who are there are healthy representatives of the community and they are not destructive or taking advantage or trying to damage or hurt others. They're not showing up to prey upon others. And they've taken steps at times to remove people who are known predators. And
and
I'm really,
that's
it's really
yeah, that's a huge part
good.
of what punk has been, right? I mean, we were talking about it before, but that is Biafra Nazi punks fuck off, and being very clear about who do we want here and who do we not want here. It's Kathleen Hanna, girls to the front, and if we got guys in the crowd out there who are attacking women, who are placing hands on women, who are acting aggressively towards women, they gotta go. It's the Gilman scene. Tim Armstrong tells this great story about like a group of skinheads who mobbed up to the Gilman complex, and were there to crash some shows and mosh and smash kids up, and just do the skinhead thing, which is to be overtly violent. And when word comes that, hey, look, we got these skinheads out in the parking lot, they're getting ready to come in, what did everybody inside do? They grabbed golf clubs and 2x4s and bike chains and went out there and literally fought the skinheads off to defend their scene. But in so doing, Armstrong talks about the fact that we were defending each other. Like this is our thing. This is our space for us to be the people that we are. And if somebody wants to come in here and co-opt it or take it or victimize the people who are in this place, not only are we not going to, foster that within our scene, we're not going to have musicians or people on the inside, but we're also going to, be sure to exclude anybody from the outside who might want to come in and do that same sort of thing. And this has been, like I said, this core element of punk from the beginning. This is, a place for all of us to experience ourselves and each other, but do so in a way that's not exclusive. In a way, let's be inclusive of each other in all the different ways that might be, right? So, do we want to have mob violence out on the street? No. But if you have a bunch of people who are coming in and they're there to hurt, then yeah, you do want to defend what you have created. That doesn't always have to be violence with violence. I would say that these are more acts of love. This is solidarity with each other, right? And it sounds like Team Nonexistent. Like I said, the young people right now, they get the assignment. They understand what this is.
Yeah, spoken like a true teacher, getting the assignment.
That's right.
And and with that, the roots of punk being masculine, being male dominated, what we're seeing now is that shift, and we've seen it for many years, but it's just so clear now, of moving from brotherhood or sisterhood, as we saw in some of the Riot Girl stuff, into siblinghood.
Yeah.
We are all here.
Totally.
And this is a safe space. It is inclusive until there is damage and harm, and we will protect against that. And I think this evolution of siblinghood is so huge, especially right now for the youth who are in this the Zoomers in particular are in this really interesting time. So we know Zoomers are not dating the way past generations did. They're not having relationships in the same way. They're not having sexual intimacy in the same way. And there's a lot of talk. I actually just listened to a podcast this morning that's politically focused, and they were talking about Zoomers in particular. But there's some big divides happening between people who identify as men who are Zoomers and women. And they're, because of the effects of COVID and the social isolation that happened for many of them in their formative years of when you learn to have socialization across gender, they are hyper separated into men and women. So there are women's spaces and women feel bonded and connected. Men feel not needed by women. These young men feel more pushed away by women, and they don't have that connection. So it's a little bit of that incel, and then I reclaim myself because, I choose to be incel now because women are rejecting me, and women are going, yeah, if you're kind of like that, we don't necessarily want to be around you.
Yeah,
and there's this
stuff, yeah.
This real divide. Exactly. And there's this real divide right now in general for Zoomers. And what I think is so amazing with bands like Team Nonexistent and these other bands that are showing up right now doing intentional inclusivity as part of their work is a space for all gender affiliations along the spectrum to be together and be with one another and feeling in community regardless of ability, gender, age, etc.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you really nailed something there with the idea of the isolation and how a lot of young people in our society today don't know how to orient themselves towards each other, don't know how to interact with one another. We see it in education all the time. We talk about this idea of how isolated young people report feeling, how untrustful of each other they are. And it's really easy to say like, oh, it's just the internet, or it's just this one thing, or it's just that other thing. I think that like one of the things that it's indicative of is like, as we continue to internalize, as we continue to move into ourselves and worry to the point of paralysis, what it means to have interactions, to have social awkwardness, to have some of those parts of just the human experience by being so internally oriented and focused, while at the same time existing in a place that allows you to create ever greater divides between the people who you live with and around. This sort of need for places like a punk rock club, or a record store, or a coffee shop where you can just sit down and play, right? This is really important, where people can actually go through the challenges of finding who they are, of building an identity that is complicated, that is multifaceted, but it's also resilient. And I think that one of the things that I've always loved so much about punk, and I've talked about it in previous episodes, is that for me as an individual, especially when I was young, when I was searching through my own wilderness, the one place I always knew who I was with the music, either in my headphones, in my room, or at a show. And then have that interaction with other people over time, revealed the generative ability, not just of punk, but just with being with other people, experiencing something that you love. And I think that that's really, really important. And one of those things that can be a bulwark against the manosphere, that can be a bulwark against the trad wife, the type of internet culture that's shaming of various gender identities, and creating these partitions within society that are so harmful for us.
Yeah, something we've talked about around punk historically that I think takes on new life for me now in this scene that exists and is continuing to emerge, is this idea of you being who you are authentically does not negate who I am, but it allows me to be more of who I am and who I'm becoming.
100%.
And we've seen this all throughout the history of punk, right? And this is where, in today's episode, talking about some of the bands that unknowingly set the foundation for these bands that are emerging in this sort of inclusive Denver punk scene that we're seeing right now. And it's probably happening other places too. This just happens to be where we live and who we've been talking to and what we've been experiencing. But these bands that came before did not necessarily know they were paving a way for something. They just saw something happening that they responded to. Mm-hmm. So I would posit that bands like X-Ray Spex, and especially early on Dead Kennedys, Against Me, did not realize, I mean, they were being authentic and they were creating a space for people in a time and place, but I don't believe they were going, oh, let's look ahead. We'll make space for these other bands to come. But they have done that by being authentic. Again, we come back to that word, authentic to themselves, to their bands, to their ethos, to their values in the moment, allowing these newer bands to emerge with a similar authenticity and continue to evolve the scene and the music. And there's an example of that from my conversation with Team Nonexistent. I actually gave them a little hard time because they were talking about meeting Rachel Jane Grace, and they just were, they were first name basis, going first name basis, and I was like, oh, you're just like that tight now. Where you just on a first name basis. It was very funny to me. But they were saying how they were talking with her about their first tour. They had a few dates lined up, and then they filled in with open mic nights so that they were continuing to play and have exposure. And she validated them, saying that that is exactly what she had done with her first tour. And that's how a tour was made. And that it was less about the validation that another queer identifying person validated us for being a queer band, but it was more like validating of, oh, we did the DIY thing that punks do, and another band had done the same thing. So, we're kind of doing it right, the validation, even though they had come up with this idea of their own. And I think that is another piece around punk that is so important and is part of the fabric of punk is you do not have to let societal definitions or norms define the experience you want to have or the world you want to create. That DIY ethos is so baked in. You don't need an agent to book you 25 venues to call it a tour. You can have a couple and fill it in between and make your own tour.
Yeah, totally. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's how a lot of those early punk bands in the 80s got their exposure, was they were talking to each other, or they were just going out on their own and then creating lists and sharing these lists through zines, Maximum Rock and Roll and Ian MacKaye, who were kind of at the forefront of this kind of, get yourself out there and get known by whomever you can, wherever you can, and then go on to your next thing and your next step. And in so doing, you find the people across the country who are also maybe not knowing what they're looking for, but then, you find them, you get in contact with them, you play music with them, for them, you write with them, whatever it might be. And things continue to grow. And these are those organic connections that we're talking about that are so possible. I think that's the other part of this too, is that in a time where I think, like, contrary to what people had hoped or expected the internet to do, which was to open up society and really challenge the idea that there's limited possibilities, and you can only know so much, and you can only know so many people, and the internet was supposed to be this gateway towards all things, and it was a panacea for society. And I think we've seen the opposite of that, right? Like, the algorithm and the curated nature of how we interact with the internet creates, again, those silos that people fall into and become stuck within. And something as simple as, like, hey, I'm going to go out on tour with this other band, or I'm just going to go out to this coffee shop and I'm going to play, and then maybe I drive myself to this other place, and this is the real possibility. And then when you're out there, you're with other people. And I know we've talked so much about this, and it's like this repetitive thing that I know I say over and over again, but it's just so important to have real connections with other people in your life. And the one thing that punk isn't is it's not isolated. It's never been something you do by yourself. It's not a thing that is meant for being in your room on your headphones. It's not prog rock. You know what I'm saying? It's not like sitting down and listening to Yes, which, like, not a shot at a genre of music, but it is a critique of how you experience that music. And And there's just this reality that like if all punk was like audiophile music, then it would never have become what it is. It wouldn't have the legs or the longevity that it's had. It would be of a moment in time, and that's it. What makes punk is you get together with other people and you experience yourself and them simultaneously, and you grow from that experience. More often than not you grow. Some people don't, right? That's we've talked about some of them. But the reality is most people grow, and they become better for it.
Well, and those that didn't kept a lone wolf mentality.
Yeah.
So in the episode where we talk about a particular figure in
Scott
punk,
Sturgeon, you can say his name. It's all right. He's not going to listen
oh,
to this.
well, you can say his name. but he's he is a lone wolf. His bands don't stay together. They don't work because he is stuck in this space. And you don't get the singular singer-songwriter in punk the way you do in other genres, because it is communal. It is a community effort as a band, and it is a communal experience as an audience. And that is it's baked into the structure. It is absolutely necessary and needed. And there are a bunch of punk artists, punk songs, punk albums that I love, but listening to them alone is never the same as the experience of seeing them live. Whereas I have seen many other bands live where I'm like, I really could have just stayed home and listened to the album.
Yeah.
Like,
No, totally.
Punk lives in the present moment of the experience.
Yeah, and I think that that's why for some people I think they look at punk and they think like, oh well, this is something you age out of, or this is something that is a part of who you are, because it's I did punk when I was also angry at my mom in my room when I was 16, or you know what I'm saying? Like it's and it can be used that way. Anything could be used in any way. But I think that like some of the difference between, I want to circle back real quick on Scott Sturgeon and some of the stuff, because as we were talking, it kind of struck me in a way that, we have talked about him multiple times and what it is about, Leftover Crack and Scott Sturgeon that like this leaves you wanting and then also revolted at certain elements as well. And I think what it kind of boils down to, whether it's the person who wants to listen to punk by themselves in their room, or it's Scott Sturgeon as a lone wolf or whatever it is that, when you're using punk only to stand against something, but not with anybody else, that's when it washes out and that's when it goes away. And it gets back to that idea that you were talking about with Team Nonexistent of siblinghood, of actually finding the people in your scene and building each other up and feeling like a true, authentic love and connection for those people. Because if they're here probably for the same reason that you're here. And therefore, you guys have something in common right away, a bond that's worth nurturing and growing. And people like Sturgeon, part of the reason why I think, I don't want to armchair psychologize, but like, why do the drugs and the crust core attitude and all this sort of stuff? Why does that continuously flow to the front for someone like him? Because he doesn't want to have that connection with other people. And this is what, punk doesn't stand with. So you can have all the right lyrics, you can have all the right politics, you can have all those things that we also acknowledge that Sturgeon has. But at the end of the day, people aren't going to be there with you if you're not there with them too. And I think that's the difference. And that's what teams like Team Not Exist or bands like Team Not Existent get, is that you're here with other people and you're going to go find those other people if they're not there. And then you're going to grow. Right. And I love the play on the name, like you said, Team Non-Existent, the team that doesn't exist. But it's very clear that like there was a yet in there, right? It's the team that doesn't exist yet. Right. And I think that's, again, like way to get the assignment. Like, good job. I just love it. Yeah.
And I'll add into that with another band, the Dead Pioneers, local to Denver.
Yeah.
And that they are a band comprised of one man who identifies as has roots as native roots, and then two white males that back him up, and they do more spoken word than singing. And they talk about this on stage, that they even make, he even makes little jabs and jokes about, like, my white men over here making this happen. But that this idea of, instead of being like, oh, this band must be all one
Right.
identity, all the same, it's like, we can promote this and build this together. Another example being the work that Jello Biafra's been doing in music promotion over the last few years, which is intentionally having music festivals using his privilege and his earned credibility in punk to intentionally bring diverse musicians to the table. And you and I had a chance to experience that at the Levitt Pavilion last summer, where it was intentionally a very diverse group of musicians that don't normally get platformed. A woman that was wheelchair bound, the Dead Pioneers were there as well, and many other bands that might just get looked over in the traditional white male bookings of punk. And there are many folks out there who, like Jello, Propagandhi being another, being very intentional to use both the privilege and the earned cred to make things happen for other people that might not have those advantages.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's been, really, as you've talked to me a lot about the Denver scene and some of your experience talking to some of the bands as part of this project, but also just part of just like you experiencing the scene and enjoying it the way that you have, that's been so uplifting, is the way in which whether it's the Denver scene or more broadly this iteration of punk in the 2020s has very intentionally taken to heart what it means to bring along other musicians with you, to bring along other people with you, and to create that space, hold that space, create that platform for those musicians to get their art and their message out there. That I'm just, again, when I was growing up in Denver in the 90s, skinhead violence, just the nature of the scene in Denver, where there was always this kind of like menace, almost might be a good word for what it was like to be at these shows, where like when you're a teenager, that's exhilarating because you're out there doing something that you're not supposed to be doing, and you're being exposed to this world of transgression and violence and chaos. And we've talked about it before, this idea that, like, for some people, myself included, when I was young, this is a place for my my anger to be expressed. Looking back on it, it's just like, man, like, not only was this like a monochromatic scene racially, but then also it was a scene that was, clearly at times seeking to victimize other people in a way that, in this part of the country in the late 1990s, not only was there like, profound skinhead violence in Denver and Fort Collins, but you had Matthew Shepard's murder in Wyoming, just right up I-25. This, idea that, like, punk rock and was going to be a place to foster hatred was real. And to see the sea change over the last 30 years, and to know that these bands are out there policing themselves and creating a culture where you can be the type of thing that, like, conservatives and people would say is a joke, like somebody who is neurodivergent, non-binary, just sort of tacking on things. And people used to say, like, oh, that's a joke. And then said, no, it's not a joke. It's a, like, this is who I am, and it doesn't matter what you have to say about it. It's just so heartening. It really is. And for that to come out of something like punk rock, a place where so many people would just outrightly reflexively assume, like, not those guys, air quote guys, like, that's really cool.
Yeah, and there's another A word that that I think is appropriate here. So we've talked about authenticity a lot today as a root of punk, but anger is
Hmm.
another key feature of punk where it's I am angry. I have a right to be angry. I feel angry, and I'm going to express my anger through music. And you spoke about there are times where some of that anger crossed some lines and became problematic. And what we see in this shifting scene is that anger is a uniting force without the violence. So there's a lot of anger in Team Non-Existence lyrics and music, and even the songs that have a little bit poppier of a sound to them have that angry undertone around being marginalized, being victimized, being treated poorly, and that reclaiming the space with anger. And it's happening in this super inclusive way, this really inspirational way. And for me, it's been really, there's been a side benefit from getting to know this scene a little bit more in that I have a teenager who's non-binary, and being able to go to concerts with my teen and have them see other young people who are older than them, young adults, as role models and representations, not just those on the stage, but those in the audience, and how it is okay to be angry. And there's such a tendency in our culture to repress anger and to teach. We say to children their anger is okay, but we actually tell them it's not okay, because when they try to express it, we stifle it, consciously or unconsciously. We say it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to throw things. Well, I mean, I still throw things sometimes when I'm angry.
Right.
There is a physical aspect to the emotion of anger, and we accidentally tell children, and then over time they become adults, we tell them accidentally to repress their anger, and they lose touch with it. And it's so amazing to see these spaces of healthy anger that's not devolving into we are harming one another and we are hurting one another, but we are bonding over this shared experience of having things happen in our lives that make us angry, because we all have those.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's what you're describing is the difference between someone who goes to the show and gets in the pit and throws themselves around and gives themselves over to the music in the moment in a way that is part of a healthy relationship with yourself and others, because the people in the pit are there to be in the pit with you. And the person who gets in the pit and who's throwing punches and elbows and knocking over people, and stomping them, and then, when confronted, wants to have a fist fight, right? Those two things are not the same. There's a difference between, raging against the machine, if you will, and somebody who just wants to fuck shit up. And those are different things fundamentally. And you're right. We more often than not want to dovetail anger and emotion, into, just this, well, it's only a destructive outlet and a destructive emotion as this is all anger can be, as opposed to you can have these internal feelings and you want to deal with them, you want to cope with them, but do so in a way that's, I don't want to say appropriate, feels like such a hollow word. Authentic. Again, let's just go back to the word of the day here. And do so in a way that's like, when you're done, thrashing around in the pit or whatever it is, and then you look over at the person next to you and you high five, or you give them that, the bro hug, the one I'm talking about, right? Just that quick little side hug with someone, share a smile and go off on your other way. Like those are different things. And we should all want more of, like, hey, I'm going to interact with other people, I'm going to do so in a way that's going to allow me to be in touch with myself, but not in a way that's going to hurt or, denigrate somebody else. Right. And that's the exact thing we're hoping to avoid. Right. Because if you just wanted the violence, there's a lot more efficient ways to be violent than a mosh pit or a punk rock song, to just be frank about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we've talked about in many of these episodes, is construction destruction, right? Sometimes you have to destroy or deconstruct in order to construct, but destruction for itself is often an unhealthy outlet. And that, I think, kind of sums up a little bit of what you are talking about here around the authentic anger is constructive. The violent anger just for the sake of getting your rocks off is a destructive element that does not lead to a greater purpose.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
All right. I think we've reached a wrap-up point. Is there anything else you want to share on this topic?
No, I think that, like I said, yeah, I think the most heartening thing, as I've been getting more, back into more of the local band stuff of late, with more shows at the Gothic and the Bluebird for the people who are around here, and very happily the Federal Theater has reopened after 50 years of being shuttered, and they've been doing some fun shows, and I had an opportunity to get down there and see some local bands, and we'll be back down there next month to see a couple more local bands, which I'm really looking forward to. I do really just think that we're lucky to be in this kind of like renaissance place of punk. I think it's not coincidental to me that we're seeing this really inclusive scene developing, this type of punk rock that is much more in solidarity with each other's happening during this period in time politically for our country. Some of the stuff we talked about with regards to Dropkick Murphys previously, where I think people are really starting to understand the relationships to each other. And I like I said, I just feel really fortunate to live in a scene right now where local bands are talking about like, hey, this is kind of a unique sort of scene, a unique sort of thing based on what we're seeing when we're out on the road, and knowing that like, I get to take my kids to these shows, and like you said, you get to take yours, and be able to say like, hey, this is what punk rock's really about. Like, don't let TV or other people snow you. Like, this is the true thing. This is the real deal, and it's not just violence and drugs and nihilism. There's a lot more going on here, right? I think we're really fortunate to be in this place, right? Even though it sucks that it has to come about because of some of the things that are going on. It's nice to know that people aren't giving up or giving in either.
Yeah, punk is maturing nicely.
Yeah, it's getting old, but it's getting old gracefully.
All right. So definitely shout out and thank you to Cheap Perfume and Team Nonexistent for talking with me last year even to share with me a little bit of your history, your insights on the scene as it's growing and emerging and changing. And with that, we wrap up today's conversation on life and growth and punk by talking about a scene that is ever growing and changing, and look forward to continuing to see it grow and maybe informing future episodes.
It'd be awesome.
I agree. All right. Thanks for listening. Take good care of yourself.
Bye.